All right, I think maybe we can start right now. So more people are joining us. We can start with just a quick overview of climate decode and other stuff. So thank you everyone for joining us today to talk about the newly established industrial carbon pricing system in India called as Indian Carbon Credit Trading Scheme. Today are joining me, Abhi and Elton, to provide insight on India carbon market and global carbon market and see how it can apply to the Indian CCTS market. But before we get into today's discussion on India CCTS, I'd like to briefly introduce climate decode. And before that, be mindful that you can drop your question in the Q&A box. It's provided in the chat, and we get back to those questions by the end of the call. So Climate Decode is an agentic platform designed to turn climate ambition into executable plan. The organization today have climate targets, decarbonization strategies, compliance obligation, and voluntary claims. But the point is that these are often managed through disconnected spreadsheets, models, and presentation across different teams and departments in siloed practices. So our platform brings these pieces together into a single climate balance sheet. This allows sustainability, finance, and procurement team to evaluate decarbonization pathways, residual emission coverage, and compliance obligation in one integrated system. So the goal here is that to support investment-grade decision-making rather than fragmented climate planning across multiple departments across the company. And our broader vision is that every major emitter and investor will eventually operate on a connected climate planning layer, similar to how financial systems operate today. In this model, assets, decarbonization projects, portfolios, and environmental claims are all linked in one structured framework that makes climate action measurable, auditable, and strategically aligned with business decisions. Our approach is built around three pillars that help organizations bridge the gap between climate liability and climate opportunity. The first pillar is Tranova, our agentic AI platform for decarbonization and compliance planning. Tranova helps companies manage the net zero transition by evaluating their assets, identify practical decarbonization space, and understanding the cost of reducing emission. It allows organizations to compare different technologies and operational changes and each option reduce emission most effectively while also meeting regulatory requirements. Then the second pillar is Canopy, our other agentic AI platform for residual emission management. So even with strong decarbonization efforts, some emission remains. Canopy helps organizations manage those remaining emissions through environmental instruments such as offsets and other environmental attributes to enable companies to manage exposure and environmental claims in a structured way. And finally, our third pillar is our advisory practice, which is our traditional advisory services focused on connecting climate policy with real-world implementation. Climate and carbon markets are highly policy-driven, so organizations clear understanding of how regulations, incentives, and market mechanisms interact. Our advisory work focus on regulatory interpretation, market analysis, and strategy design to ensure climate plans both compliant and economically viable. So overall, our goal is to create an integrated approach that connects decarbonization actions, environmental market, and policy framework into one decision-making system. With that, I'm handing over to Elton to talk about our global experience in compliance carbon markets and lessons that can be applicable to India.
Thank you, Karosh. Good evening, everybody. Good morning, depending where you are. So as we look at, quickly I'll introduce myself. So I spent 24 years at Nova Chemicals. About 20 of those years on large emitter regulations. I have an environmental science background. That's how it started, doing NOx, SOx, other emissions, and then greenhouse gases kind of got integrated. And then as the policies developed, the price forecasts started to jump. We started to look at, 10, 20 years, we're going to be paying 100 million, 50 million a year. it really took over my life. And so then I've been doing climate policy ever since, and climate regulations, emission quantification, kind of the full gamut on the greenhouse gas side. So as we look at the India program, it really trying to just add some perspective, as I'm sure many of you know, some of you may be less familiar. There are greenhouse gas programs throughout the world. I think we're up to about 95 jurisdictions that have a compliance greenhouse gas program of some kind, encompassing about, I think, 28% of the global greenhouse gas emissions. These programs, there's kind of two big categories. Again, every jurisdiction has sort of different tweaks and multiple layers of these programs. But in the end, when we look at a similar system to the system like in India, the big ones are cap and trade systems, so a cap-based system. So while allowances are given on an intensity-based basis, the overall program has an absolute cap, and the rules all tighten and control that the whole system allowances are given out underneath that cap. And as that cap comes down, everyone allowances has to align, because again, you can't go over that total emissions. The other category is more of what you could call a baseline and credit system. Sometimes an output-based pricing system is what it's called. Again, the naming isn't consistent. And those are more where there isn't a cap on the overall program, and the intensity is how allowances are given, or credits are either your threshold for what you're allowed to emit, or your credits are given to you based on an intensity-based program. And this is really in line with a lot of the Canadian programs, and then also with the India CCTS is a similar type program where it's a baseline and credit type system. Next slide, please. So as you look at a new program, things are always a little bit more fun. Regulatory uncertainty is always an aspect of a new program, but really with a new program, that volatility in the regulatory side is really quite high. So I was lucky enough to be involved in the Alberta program when it kicked off in 2008, and really you could see the number of changes and things that had to be revamped as they went. Really seeing certain sectors doing either too well, because the program theoretically are designed to motivate change and help provide financial push for decarbonization. And so if you were able to generate credits, I mean, they can allow some credit generation, but at some point, the idea is that it pushes change. And so what can happen early on is things don't quite work the way they think they do. Again, either there's the price of carbon, the demand is too high, and the price goes up super high, and then that's not viable. Again, you're now putting companies at risk. On the flip side is the price can be driven too low, right? No one needs any credits. And so then that is not driving change either. So early on, things can really be, it would not surprising that early on, things can be quite volatile. There also be things that are missed, right? Things that were not understood as the program goes that don't quite work. So again, the first early years, there can be quite a bit of uncertainty and volatility. And that also drives, from a company perspective, you want to make sure they're advocating, right? Because as you find things, you're ahead of the game, right? You think things that don't work, don't make sense for you. And that's where, again, that early on is the time you want to catch those before it's too late and you get locked into a program that is needlessly over punishing you. Then onto the data and MRV infrastructure gaps. So really now you're talking about data where you used to report greenhouse gases. Most companies do in some way, either in ESG capacity or for other reporting. But now we're talking where there's lots of money involved. So are you able to monitor this in a way and measure this in a way that is adequate? The other aspect that can come with this is infrastructure and metering. Do you have the metering to measure greenhouse gases properly? Generally, metering in a lot of the plants, especially the older plants, are designed to make the plant run. They're not designed to quantify greenhouse gas emissions. So if you do need to put metering in, that can be shutdowns, right? And shutdowns can be very costly. And again, very difficult to get the metering that you need to pass a verification. So yeah, again, back to that point, just we're talking as the value increases too in compliance with time, the money involved, you want your data to be as good as it can be. So again, you really want to be able to quantify that data, and do you have the ability to do so both from a people perspective and also from measuring it at the plant level. Another fun one with the early programs is verification bottlenecks, and really all administration challenges. Does the government have any clue how much work this is? right? So as for on the verifier side, you know, getting verifiers trained, getting consistent verification between companies, because you should be driving for equality and fairness between all industry. You need that consistency between verifiers. So it takes a while for them to train and learn that and get that consistency, and even have the number available that you need. So there is, again, that sort of administration challenges that come early on, even from when engaging with the government itself or their programs. If there's lots of challenges, problems, do they have the people to support the companies to be able to move this forward, and again, keep things rolling and keep this new program working? Because again, I don't know that they totally appreciate how much work this can be and how complicated it can be very quickly. Next level, we'll talk about liquidity and price discovery risk. So really, and honestly, from a company perspective, early in the market, things are scary. What is the credit worth, right? How do you know you're paying a fair price? How do you know what someone else paid? Again, when you're trying to negotiate with somebody who has extra, how do they know what to sell it at? What's it worth to them? And this is very difficult early on. And then as a company, when you're looking internally, getting your internal systems and be able to have the internal discussion, you need internal leadership buy-in to spend the money on these credits. Well, how do you verify that price is fair and reasonable? All these things are very challenging early on. And so trying to get that price discovery is very important. Benchmarks. So benchmarks, hopefully people know, and you will learn very quickly, that benchmark is one of the most important pieces of compliance. It drives almost all the cost. A good benchmark can really help you out. A bad benchmark, whether it's just because of the way the math works, or again, some other factors, it can really hinder or increase the cost very quickly. And so and then the tightening rates gets applied on top of that. So the stringency tightening rates are generally a couple percent, 1 to 5, depending on the jurisdiction, and there are some variation within the CCTS program. And just so people know, based on the calculations, because these are intensity based, the way this works, it's a large emission number minus a large allowance number leads to a very small number. So a 2% change in stringency is magnified in terms of a cost compliance. So a 2% stringency change can lead to a cost of compliance increase of over 20%, and even more depending on how large your emissions are. So it magnifies a lot bigger than you think, and it can quickly deteriorate. If you are in an advantageous position, that can deteriorate very quickly. And then finally, kind of going over another big piece of this is the governance and financial blind spots. So as a company, trying to understand how you're managing a new system, right, internally. So you need to have the controls in place to be able to manage it, and manage it like any other cost to operate. So like you have programs and systems for managing purchasing power and purchasing natural gas. Carbon isn't much different. It is different, but it can be seen in a similar way, where you've got to have the systems in place to be able to manage it and make sure you can acquire credits as you need them, can manage assets. How do you manage it, and how do you do that in the short term and in the long term? And so these things can be very difficult early on if you don't have the infrastructure and don't have the history of having to deal with this. And I lived through this, and it took forever to really have these programs and be able to understand this internally in a way that was able to manage it in the correct way. Next slide, please. So when you think about these sort of challenges that come with a new program, so then you look at yourself and you're thinking about, again, how do you get yourself sort of ready as an organization to handle a new program? So really the first one is really emission management. All right, how do you manage your emissions and monitor them and be able to do it in a more structured way and a more vigilant way? You'll have to pass a verification, right? So that can be much more challenging than just reporting on an ESG basis. Again, some companies, you may be doing this already, but in a lot of cases you're not or haven't been historically. And so again, because of the financial implications, this has a much different challenge to it. So you want to be able to manage, and you also want to monitor it throughout the year, because you want to be able to forecast what your compliance cost is. You don't want to end up short. And so that really transitions to the next layer, sort of monitoring things at a site level, but then also at a corporate exposure level. So if you have multiple facilities, while some facilities might be long, some might be short. And so that balance is very important, because again, you want to be able to monitor as a company where you are overall, not just at the facility level. And are certain facilities causing issues for you, right? Is that something that's going to be an issue? Is one facility driving everything? So then does that something, again, you put more effort into monitoring that facility either because of the it's where its benchmark is, or because of the magnitude of the emissions, you want to make sure that you're monitoring that. Just a simple thing. When I look at back for us, shutdowns at certain plants, while you plan your compliance, it's forecast to be say 2-3 million. Unexpected shutdowns would cost between $500,000 and $1 million, right? Because if you're shut down for 3 or 4 weeks trying to fix a problem, you're running boilers, you're making emissions, you're not making product, and that cost on a compliance side can add up very quickly. So then, as you look, so again, then the transition from this is you're monitoring your sort of yearly compliance. Now looking, this is a multi-year strategy. How do you manage that? Again, this is sort of going back to where I spoke to, where the stringency will impact things. If you're long now and long for a couple of years, when does that run out? And how do you manage that compliance in 5 years? If you use up the credits you have or sell them to get, equity in the short term, again, that can be a valid decision. But how are you managing compliance in 5 years when you then suddenly have to pay and likely at a higher price? And so you really want to look at compliance in a 5, 10, 15 year sort of scale, managing that with the risks of the regulation uncertainty as well. So in the end, it's managing the risk of future compliance and managing the risk of losing the value of credits. You don't want to hold too many and then find out they're not worth anything because the market crashes. So again, there's complexity in managing that strategy as a multi-year strategy, as opposed to just how am I going to comply for this year. Next level, again, now we're looking again, the CCTS. Ultimately, it's designed to decarbonize. So you want to align your strategy with your ESG goals and with the costs associated with the program. So the program will lead to cost. You'd rather be using that money to make reductions as opposed to giving that money away or having to spend to comply. And so it should begin to integrate into your decarbonization efforts and align with that as your compliance will increase or your allowances decrease. And then at the end, really, the other piece the company you need to do is tracking the market and the regulations. So is there a market flux? Does it go up and down? Does it change by season? You want to monitor that. Is there expected, do you see a supply demand? You want to really monitor that. Is there an influx coming? Are there big reduction projects coming? Are there changes in the regulations that can dramatically impact things? These are things that you need to monitor. And this became a big chunk of what my career has been, is watching these regulations and even watching other regulations as rules change. As you see CBAM in Europe, does that impact your thinking, right? The regulation changes in other jurisdictions add pressure that you could see being pushed in your location. So again, these things all add up to, again, being able to monitor this program, being ready in the short term and ready in the long term, and advocating, right? You want to advocate as much as you can to make sure that you're being treated fairly with your industry, because again, the government won't understand your industry. And so there can be things that are rules that are made that apply, make sense for some, but not for yours. And so all these things add up to really being ready to manage this program and make sure you're ahead of it and not being subject to the results of it. You're pushing ahead and monitoring, staying ahead of as much as you can and pushing for the things that help make sure that your facility, your company is in the best position it can be. I will stop there. I will hand it over to Abby to dive into the India CCTS.
Greetings, everyone. This is Abhishek. I'm the market lead in climate decode for CCTS. So before we move on to discuss market outlook, it is very useful to understand, how India has arrived at the CCTS framework. So India actually began its carbon market goal towards it with the PAT scheme in 2012. So it was an energy efficiency mechanism where industrial facilities reduce the energy intensity, and for that they received tradable certificates. And then it took nearly a decade, that a major turning point to come in with the Energy Conservation Amendment Act and DEC 2022, which became pretty much a legal foundation for establishing the nationwide carbon market. Following that, the CCTS scheme, the Carbon Credit Trading Scheme, was formally notified on June 2023, and it was administered by the Bureau of Energy Efficiency, that's the BEE, and the trading was overseen by the Central Electricity Regulatory Commissions. And then coming to, it took another year actually. By October 2024, they released the compliance procedure covering the MRV rules, the credit issuances, and what's the surrender mechanism. Even recently on 27th of February this year, we saw another notification for the trading. We'll reach there on the next slide. But to cover this slide, this last year, October 2025 and early 13th Jan 2026, the government notified GI notifications for mostly all the sectors except for iron and steel is still not out, and fertilizer draft notification is still not out. So overall, with all these 8 sectors, we're gonna start the first compliance year this year with nearly 740 plus facilities, and where we will see this policy design of CCTS coming to actual implementation. So next we'll be covering what is the market design and coverage here. So to understand how the market will behave, we need to understand how the system works structurally. So as Elton mentioned about the global market, the major markets are the cap and trade market, which looks into absolute emissions, but India is an intensity-based carbon market, meaning that obligations are set based on emissions per unit of output, not on the absolute emissions. So each facilities or firm obligated entity will receive a GEI benchmark, and if that facility performs better, basically the GEI is lower than the benchmark, they will generate carbon credits or triple Cs. If it's the benchmark, if the GEI is much more the benchmark, then they have to purchase and surrender triple Cs. The one important thing that is different from the PAT scheme here is 1 triple C or carbon credit here is 1 ton of CO2 equivalent reduction related to the benchmark. So that is an important factor here. And as you can see in the slide, there are 8 cover sectors: cement, iron, steel, aluminum with both primary and secondary, petrochemicals with refinery and as well as crackers. And overall, it overall accounts for nearly 700 to 750 million tons of CO2 equivalent emissions. Another very important factor that it is important to know is that the penalty structure, because if you're not surrendering your triple Cs or carbon credit, if you are obligated to, then it's basically twice the market price. So it is going to be very fundamentally driven by prices and the market dynamics. Can you move to the next slide? Yeah, thank you. So here you can look, it's a tree map. It's a tree map of the sectoral emission market size for financial year 23-24. So this is a real emission here that we have seen from the past. So why is this important? Why is it important to see sector wise? It is very important because it tells us where carbon credit supply and demand will originate. The sectoral balance will ultimately determine the market liquidity, the trading behavior and the price formation. You see here in the nearly green box that iron and steel is nearly 46% and cement is around 35%. So overall it accounts 80% of the compliance market. Assume that if these two sectors become suppliers of carbon credit, so the market will be just at the floor level because the demand side will be very small. So there should be a market balance, and we need to understand the market size to see from where supply and demand can be formed and where the trading can happen. So this gives us the understand the market size, and then we look into what is more important, reduction. So can you move to the next slide, Purush, please? So we are looking at the weighted average GI targets for each sector. So we have modeled everything based on sectors, each industry. So overall, each sector has to reduce between 1.6% to 3%, depending on their decarbonization planning and their targets. And the initial phase of CCTS is relatively moderate, focusing on measurable improvement rather than very, very aggressive decarbonization. And right now the market might seem a bit easier, but as a target tightens after the initial years of 26-27 coming financial year, we expect stronger supply demand dynamics and clear prices signals with the GI targets. So understanding GI targets is also important to understand what are your obligations. What do you need to submit? Could you move to the next slide, please? So reporting obligations. What we have here, it's not about only energy reduction. It's not about only you monitoring your emissions on a daily basis. It's also important to understand how the compliance cycle works in real practice. This is a real implementation happening in India for the first time. So before entering this market, each obligated entity first registered in the ICM, the National Carbon Market Registry. And once this cycle begins, company must submit a monitoring plan and annual activity data within the first 3 months. I think most of the companies have already done it, sectors have done it because it came on 8 and in January. So, coming here, so, like then you have to track throughout the year, you have to track the emissions, productions according to the approved MRV procedures. And after the compliance period ends, companies must submit the verified GHG emission report, which will be reviewed and certified. And if anybody is required to surrender triple Cs, they have to have a compliance statement. And if there is a shortfall after the trading window, the entity must pay the compensation within the 90 days. So overall, this will be a very data-driven and a long-term planning. Planning is required in this, not only reporting, but it has to be a long-term plan to actually comply with the CCTS. Could you move to the new slide? Yeah. So this is what I'm talking about. That's a new notification that came in on 27th of Feb by CRC, this Carbon Credit Certificate Regulation 2026. So here again, it mentions very clearly in the regulation that 1 ton of CO2, one carbon credit is equals to 1 ton of CO2 reduction, which becomes the basic trading units. There'll be two, that have divided the markets into two. One is the compliance market, that is obligated one that must meet emission targets, and there's the offset market, that is where is the voluntary participants can take part. All the trading activity will be happening only on the power exchanges. This will ensure the transparency and proper price discovery. And a system, it will be managed by 3 institutions, that's the CERC, DE as we mentioned, and the Greek Controller of India, that is the GCI, that will maintain the credit registry. So it also mentions that the trading will happen monthly or periodically. That will be decided by the administrator. And prices will have a floor price and a ceiling price that we had in our market outlook in January, that we expected, because it was an intensity-based market. We're expecting a floor price and a ceiling price that we see in the new regulations that came last week. So overall, in short, also there will be penalties, bans, if there is oversell of credits. So overall, like India's carbon market now has become a structured system ready for trading and pricing and proper enforcement. So this is the overall notifications and rules that have come out till now by the government. So we will move on to look at the market outlook and go there. Can we the next slide? So what Climate Decode has done here is, like, we have taken all the policies, you looked at the policies, you understand the policies, then we have put it into quantification, and then we had our assumption, global expertise, to understand how the market can work, and we have modeled how the market will work and evolve actually. So we model the system under 3 scenarios here. So the base case, the supply heavy, and supply constraint. So I will go through the base case. All the assumptions, all the factors are the same, but it changes with the scenarios. So the base case is the most likely pathway, where we assume that the production growth will broadly align with the historical trends, and there will be a moderate decarbonization progress based on India's net zero goal of 2070 and each sector's feasible decarb solutions based on India's current technology. So across all scenarios, we have considered this, these variables, that is the benchmark tightening by the government, which will determine how strict the compliance becomes over time, or it might be the vice versa. And is the emissions intensity improvement, that is the decarbonization. So it's not about only complying and reporting and just seeing what is the emissions you are having per month or on the end of the year. It is also important to reduce. The main goal of CCTS is to reduce your emissions, country's emissions overall. So this will help you to, and in this CCTS, it will help you understand how, if you're making credits or not, if you're able to decarbonize with your planning. And the last is the production factor. The production factor is important here, as again, it's not a cap and trade system, it's an intensity based system. So intensity based, if you're lower than the intensity, your GI is lower than the intensity, you make credits. Otherwise, you have to buy credits. Another factor that we have used in our modeling is a firm size adjustment. So based on the large, medium, and small size firms and facilities, we have adjusted their decarbonization on the market conditions. Now coming to the supply heavy scenario and supply constraint. So both have all the same factors, but in the supply heavy, we assume that there's a faster technology adoption and a stronger efficiency gains, which helps to generate more credits. On the supply constraint, that's opposite of supply heavy. It assumes a slower decarbonization due to capital and technology constraint, as well as within the facilities or the firm or within the country. Okay, can you move to the next slide so we can look at the market outlook? So what we have here. So the first thing is the base case, which we expect that most probable scenario in India. So the market, of course, the market begins the moderate surplus for this financial year 25-26, around 4.3 million triple Cs, and this is largely due to the transitional benchmarks and partial year implementation that you see, because we are not going to monitor for the whole of the year, but basically a very small portion of the year. And however, in our base case, the surplus does not persist. By 27-28, we see the system moves into a deficit and the short position gradually widens. So by the end of the decade, the estimation is nearly a deficit of 10 million triple Cs annually. So, and driver here will be iron and steel, which become the dominant source of demand as benchmark tightens and production volume scales. Because we are also looking, like when you say production volume scales, we are also looking at what is the production volume that is going to offer iron and steel or cement in the coming years, based on as India is a growing country, it's a developing country. So production is mostly going to increase for this sectors. And on the other hand, cement remains structurally long and provides the main supply of credit. And however, supply will not be sufficient in the base case as demand comes from other sectors too. Could you move to the next slide, please? Thank you. So is this the supply heavy case or scenario? We expect that the decarbonization progress faster and industries outperform their benchmarks. In this case, you will see that the chart is going up because the market remains consistently long throughout the modeling period. By the end of the decade, by 2030, we expect like annual surplus of 8 to 9 million and a cumulative surplus of around 40 million triple Cs. And what happens in this case? In this case, price remains very weak. As already we know that there's a price floor now. Price will remain there because we need demand to trade. And if everybody is long, there'll be no trading happening. And this would reduce the effectiveness of the carbon market. CCTS, again, the CCTS is there because India wants to reduce its emission. So once companies, big firms will reduce their emissions through decarbonization. So in this market, extreme market scenario, there'll be no decarbonization happening. So government has to intervene if this scenario comes in. So can you move to the next slide that showcases the opposite of the supply heavy scenario here, the supply constraint scenario. What happens here? We expect that the technology and the financial barrier slows down the emission reduction. And by 26-27, there is a shortfall and that depends really rapidly. By end of financial year 29-30, we expect 20 million triple Cs annually, creating a significant scarcity. So what happens? There's a huge trigger that have the price volatility and liquidity stress. So price will basically reach the ceiling, but there will be no triple Cs to buy because most of the sectors will be, or facilities will be short. And in this case, company won't be able to decarb at this rate. And as Elton mentioned from his experience in the global markets in Canada, that even many facilities had to shut down for smaller period, longer period, because compliance really take a pretty deep cut when you wait longer actually. So this extreme scenarios suggest that the market has to be very very sophisticated, and the government needs to bring or intervene when it has to for the market to be balanced and to work in the longer period. So we have covered all the our three scenarios where we see a base case, then two extreme scenarios. Now coming to the pricing outlook, which has been a very important factor here. So like currently CCTS market has not produced any pricing yet. So we have anchored our pricing based on two references. The first is the PAT scheme, which previously regulated the energy intensity in the Indian industry, and second is the China ATS, which is the closest comparable intensity-based market. So this price scenario is under the base case, and we estimate roughly between 710 to 2,165 rupees per ton of CO2 or triple C in the first transition year. As the market becomes shorter and we see a little bit of scarcity and deficit, we expect the market to reach the price at around 4,000 rupees per ton by 2030. So at this stage, the market transition, it changes from learning phase to structurally tighter compliance market. So I think this is overall the pricing outlook. And can you move to the next slide? So we have completed what government has actually notified till now to the last one. What are our assumptions to do the market modeling, and how actually we have modeled for how the market might look in the next 5 years. So I will just quickly summarize from the base case what are the basically conclusions of it. So from the supply perspective, we see the cement sector will remain the largest and the most stable source of surplus credits. And whereas on the demand side, iron and steel is expected to become a dominant driver of credit demand from by the late of 2030, by 2030. This is why you can see, I guess most of you will know that iron and steel GI is still not out there. So you can understand that factor. So on the pricing perspective, the early years is likely to be relatively low prices, as you see between 710 to 2,165. If there is a lot of surplus, it will stick at the ceiling, the floor price. And I think this transition will ultimately determine how effective the CCTS becomes as a mechanism to drive decarbonization, which is the main reason for CCTS. I will hand it over to Kurush. How climate decode can actually play a role in your decarbonization and emission management. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you, Abby. So yeah, I'm going just to conclude our conversation today by talking a little bit about how climate decode can support industries in CCTS and actually the design of our Tranova platform and its application to India CCTS compliance. So one of the key challenges companies face under the CCTS is the amount of data required for compliance monitoring and reporting. And it is based on our experience with other global markets and the work that we have done with a couple of industries in North America, in Canadian and US markets. So the CCTS framework requires facilities to collect and organize a large volume of activity data and emission information, typically through detailed Excel-based reporting templates. With Tranova's emission manager, we tried actually to simplify this process by integrating client data directly into our platform. This can include operational data sources such as internal databases, Excel files, or even just enterprise system like SAP. Once the data is connected, Tranova organizes it according to the CCTS requirement. Then instead of managing large spreadsheets manually, companies can view their data through facility level and corporate level dashboard. These dashboards allow team to monitor monthly performance, track emission intensity, identify emission data points, and make course correction through the year rather than only at reporting time. We essentially transformed the CCTS reporting template into a live digital monitoring system. The platform highlights data gap, organizes activity data in the required structure, and support the identification of decarbonization levels and potential projects in alignment with the requirement of CCTS to actually establish a long-term reduction plan for companies. And when it comes time for reporting, Tranova can generate one-click export file aligned with the CCTS reporting format, making it easier to prepare submission and support verification. Overall, this approach reduces the administrative burden of compliance, lower compliance and reporting costs, and provides organization with better control over their emission data while ensuring they remain aligned with CCTS monitoring and reporting requirements. Then another important component of Tranova is the compliance manager. which helps organizations actively manage their compliance position and control costs under the CCTS. Instead of waiting until the end of the compliance period to understand their position, companies can use Tranova to see a forward-looking view of their exposure. The platform provides a 5-year enterprise-level forecast, allowing organizations to understand whether they are likely to be in a surplus or deficit position as production, emission intensity, and regulatory targets evolve. These forward views help organizations design smarter strategies. For example, depending on market condition and their projected compliance position, companies can evaluate options such as buying credits, selling surplus credits, or banking credit for future use. This feature is supported by our market outlook and pricing forecast that Abby explained just a little bit earlier. And the system also provides facility level and corporate level dashboards, so operators can see which plants are driving emission intensity and where operational improvements or decarbonization project could improve their position. This allows companies to understand the consolidated position across the entire organization and manage compliance strategically rather than facility by facility. And finally, another important capability of Tranova is market and policy intelligence, which helps organizations stay on top of regulatory changes and market development that directly affect their compliance exposure. Carbon markets, like the CCTS, are highly dynamic. Regulations evolve, sector benchmark may tighten over time, and market prices can change depending on the supply and demand. Tranova provides real-time market and regulatory updates, so companies can understand how these developments impact their compliance position. The platform also includes regulatory tracking, allowing users to monitor policy updates, regulatory guidance, and program changes that could affect their obligation. So overall, this market watch function is providing curated news, regulatory updates, and alerts so organizations don't miss key deadlines or important developments. Just to conclude, what we are trying to show today is that compliance process does not need to be handled through fragmented spreadsheets and manual workflow. By integrating operational data, compliance monitoring, and decarbonization planning into one platform, companies can move from reactive reporting to more proactive and strategic management of their position. The goal of our services is actually to make compliance simpler, more transparent, and less resource intensive, while also helping organizations identify opportunities to reduce costs and improve their long-term decarbonization strategy. So with that, I'll pause here, and we would be happy to go over your question and address those questions. Okay, just give me a second. Go through questions and see. Maybe we can beat this question. Will higher oil and gas prices materially affect the ETS in the coming year? Özlem, do you want to take this one?
Yeah, for sure. So I think it definitely, it's a interesting question because, again, if a decarb path for many industries can be going to switching to natural gas, especially on the power side, but other industries, if coal, of either liquid fuel or coal, so those prices can impact whether it's financially viable to switch, right? So if prices are low, really it's the competing of the price you're paying for compliance versus the price you're paying for a decarb. And so the again, a higher increase in natural gas can cause challenges to make those viable. So then you end up becomes still cheaper just to pay compliance until that price goes up, continues to go up, and makes that change, a fuel switch change, which again is not simple, right? Fuel switch change can be a full, some if it's a boiler, switching from a liquid fuel to natural gas can be costly, $20 million, $40 million, or a new boiler, which is 50 to 100. That can be a lot harder, right? So I think those costs, there's ingrained cost of fuel switch, and then the natural gas cost, if that rises, makes that the economic viability of it harder. So definitely the natural gas prices, if that's a common decarb path, which again it seems like it would be for many, then it can definitely slow things down.
Perfect, thank you. And the next question is that why is the power sector not included? I think I can take this one. So power sector is some sort of, indirectly included, but not as a sector, as a regulated sector, because in the program, companies need to also cover the scope 2 emission, which is the electricity or heat that they are using in their facility. So actually a scope 2 is covered for reporting, which means electricity consumption in facilities that somehow indirectly include power sector into the program.
And power is almost always treated specially, different, or included, not included in some different way in almost all the programs. It's almost always treated uniquely because it's a fundamental sort of need in the country and has often a different dynamic to it. Just because, as Karosh pointed out, it's a scope 2 for many, but then it's also supplying power for everybody in the country. So again, it's very often treated differently in almost every program around the world.
Perfect, thank you. So the next question, what policy levers do you think the government is most likely to use to stabilize the market if it moves too far into either surplus or shortage? Benchmark tightening, sector expansion, or offset integration? Either Elton or Abby, if you want to take this one.
The benchmark is the easiest one, so I think you can see it. So if things are long and there's too many credits, tightening the screws on the benchmark is a common way to do it because that very quickly can evaporate that sort of extra surplus. On the flip side, it happens, but I'm a bit of a pessimist that they don't generally back off on the benchmarks. So in that case, if you are undersupplied, it's how do they find ways to generate credits, and that's where I think it can be an offset side is a possibility. Again, they could. Again, I don't know they're always that concerned if the supply is short. If it is too short, and then it has to be a more drastic measure. If there's no way to comply, then that's a different challenge. And so then it'd be a more severe change in the program. I don't know, Abby, if you wanted to add anything to that.
So even if you see this, like there are two extremes as the question asked. So in case of, for example, just saying about the EU ETS, what happens there? So if there is a limit, so if it crosses the limit, it takes the allowances in, and if it's below the limit, it injects more allowances. Allowances in the sense like in ETS is carbon credit is called allowances. So it gets injected into the market, into the TNAC again, that circulates. So what Elton said, of course, it makes sense there, but if government has to intervene by taking steps, if there's a surplus, what they need, how they can absorb the surplus, or if there's a structurally shorter, and either of course benchmark tightening or loosening there, as well as offset can be a solution. But looking into all the global markets, offset has been played a very small section of it, very small percentage. Even in the EU ETS, it was allowed till 2020. In other global markets, if you see Singapore, South Korea, it allows very small percentage of the whole total emissions. However, companies don't go for that easily, but rather focus on the carbon credits. So I think government has to intervene in the benchmark in India.
Thank you. The next question, maybe Abby, you can take that one. Are credits fungible across sectors?
I also see the CCTS is a national carbon market where carbon credit certificates represents verified emissions reduction. So it can be traded between obligated entities. As you know, it was important in the slide that why we looked into the market sectoral emission market size, because if it's not obligated to trade between the entities, if it's not fungible, then the market won't work actually. So the intent is to create a fungible credit instrument rather than a siloed sector market, allowing industries such as cement, steel, aluminum, pulp and paper to trade credits based on market supply and demand, not within themselves. So the exact trading rule and exchange structures are still being finalized, and liquidity at this stage, the market is just starting. So it will depend more heavily as target stringency, stringence and participant level is increases and people are in the awareness stage. So it will take, I think, first few years, transitional years to for the market to be more fungible and more market ready. So just to say, yeah, it will a fungible credit will improve liquidity and reduce the compliance cost overall.
Perfect, thank you. The next one, do you see India's CCTS remaining a domestic compliance system or evolving towards some form of linkage with international markets or Article 6 mechanism? I can start answering this question. Elton and Abby, please provide more insight. So essentially, when we talk about compliance market, the linkage is a very complex process and requires a lot of deliberation between different markets. And specifically in this case, that when we have a national market, the linkage is not going to be an easy task to do that with other markets. First of all, you need to find another market with the similar design, intensity, based system with similar structure, even targets, decarbonization. So that linkage essentially is some sort of very impossible task to be done with other markets. And we had similar conversation even here in Canadian markets, talking about how to link different provincial markets together to have a more holistic national program. But even in provincial level in Canada, it's becoming a very challenging process, considering the transfer of transition of credits from one market to another and the impact that might have in the credit price in other markets. So it's not going to be an easy process to be done. However, for example, we have seen a successful linkage between California and Quebec in North America, both on the ETS side of the market, and they are working in tandem together. So we should see that actually how market evolves over the time and whether there is potential to link with other markets. However, on the voluntary side, yeah, there is opportunity to link offset credits from CCTS to Article 6 and other mechanisms.
And I think the big thing, so again, as we kind of roll into early 2030s, a lot of these programs will be a lot more mature. And are they working, right? So that's the question. I think you could see, I wouldn't be unreasonable, something with the carbon border adjustments, I think could change the game. If large countries, very strong trading partners are implementing carbon border adjustments, that may shift the thinking for other countries or the programs to make sure it aligns. So again, I think we're a ways away from that. I think that's something that is not happening tomorrow. But if you're looking at this in a long term, 10, 15, 20 years, you would assume at some point there would be some more homogeneity and linking between programs. But right now, as Karosh pointed out, it's so difficult and such variation between programs and countries and policy that it's very difficult to pull off. But I think as it matures, if we do see more carbon border adjustment type regulations, then I think it would make sense you'd see more alignment between the different programs across the world.
Thank you. And the next question, is your organization working on projects under the CCTS compliance market, or are you also active in the CCTS offset market? So we are active in both markets, but right now our focus is on the compliance CCTS. However, in the offset market, we also can support project developers to assess their projects, eligibility, and develop their projects under the offset system.
Just to answer one more part that I think we missed is like offsets actually can be linked to Article 6.4 currently, but India CCTS does not allow offsets at the moment. So we might see it in the future, but it is allowed currently in globally.
All right, thank you.
And we have seen recently, sorry, just real quick, I apologize. We have seen some regulatory regimes do allow voluntary offsets. I think Japan does, and then I think also in South America, or is it maybe it's a Mexican program. There are a couple that do allow voluntary offsets, and so something that may creep into other programs with time. But again, it isn't very common, and it's always a small percentage of your compliance.
Perfect. The next question: how Indian carbon credits market and policy is different from other nations? Maybe Elton, you take this one.
So again, like we said, it does align. It is relatively similar to like the Alberta tier program. I'd say ultimately it's very similar. In the end, this is a difficult question. It's a good question. It's a valid one. A lot of these programs are 90% the same, but the 10% differences are huge, right? Because like I said, the Alberta program has power integrated into it in certain ways, and they have high performance benchmarks for power, which impacts compliance for so many industries. And clearly the India program does not, right? It treats it differently. And so the math is very similar, but the subtle differences aren't small. Emission quantification is always very similar. Intensity-based calculations are always similar. Some do industry averages, which is much more common. Like in the EU, ETS is many of the benchmarks are industry averages, versus other programs do specifically for your facility, which can have a huge impact. If you are a high-performing facility, then you get penalized in one. But if you're low performing, then you get a benefit. So there's a mix that. So I think there are numerous things that are very similar, but numerous things that are very different. And some of those subtleties can lead to a big difference in terms of compliance, cost, and how it works. So yeah, it's not simple.
Perfect. So the next question is about the war that is happening right now, and what will be the current global scenario effects on the carbon credit trade due to war?
That's a good question.
That's
I think my general view, again, having seen things, if you saw the war in the Ukraine, is it can shift priorities. I think if your priority is more about, energy security can go up, which again, generally if you are not primed with resources, then natural, renewable, low carbon resources can be pushed. I think you saw that in Europe and in the UK with the invasion of the Ukraine, or the attack on the Ukraine, as fuel became more difficult to get. So that pushed a lot of their decarb programs a lot faster. But I think a lot of the challenge that comes with this destabilization of the international world and then the markets themselves really is the internalization of what your priorities are. And so is decarbonization a priority? But I think it can be just tangentially because of fuel security. Sorry, go ahead, Karosh or Abby, if you want your perspective again on that one. It's a good question too, and one that will have to be pondered some more as we see how things develop in these times.
Thank you. So I guess we have a few more questions. So we try just to wrap it up quickly. Why India kept Article 6.2 and Article 6.4 list of project activities almost same? What will happen to more than 300 CDMRE project applied for transition to PACM, which equates to more than 300 million ton of CO2 emission? So I guess the idea is to allow development of these projects under PACM mechanism and then apply 6.2 corresponding adjustment, given global market for credit without bilateral deals. that's my idea here. But definitely we can provide detailed answer after this call.
Yeah, like that's a complicated question for sure.
Yeah. And do you think obligated entities can also invest in or develop offset projects under the CCTS? So I can just quickly answer, Abby. Yeah, feel free to jump in. So essentially, right now we have two different and separate programs. One is for obligated parties under CCTS, and the other one is just offset market. At this point, there is no opportunity for offset development and using offset credits in the CCTS system. However, in the future, depending on the evolution of market, as Abby and Elton mentioned, on the way that the government wants to manage the market, it may be opportunity for offset project development and using offset credits in the market. And the last question, as per the government's CCTS notification, there are no iron and steel companies and no fertilizer companies. Can you explain why these two sectors are being included? Abby?
Could you please repeat the question?
Yeah, so right now there is no iron and steel and fertilizer draft and confirm GI. Why we have included them in our analysis? Actually, we haven't included fertilizer, it's just iron and steel.
Yeah, so firstly, we have not included fertilizer, as Kurush mentioned, but we have included iron and steel because it's nearly 50% of the market emission size. So otherwise, we're just going to have a surplus in the market. So we need to have a proper, complete outlook of the market. We have considered iron and steel. And as the financial year ends in March, we estimated that the iron and steel GI to come out this year, before the financial year, to take it forward to the next 5 years. So that was the major reason for taking iron and steel in our modeling.
So yes, iron and steel hasn't received a confirmed GI, but essentially government will provide that. So they may miss the first compliance year in 2025, but moving forward, definitely they will be part of the program. So we decided just to include them in our analysis. Perfect. I think there is no more question. And with that, maybe we can just close this call. And happy to support all of the industries through the journey in the compliance program. And feel free to reach out to us, to our